So I'm pleased today to be able to introduce to you Pete Baran. Pete Baran is a good friend. He's also the chairman of the board for the Canadian Christian Business Federation. Not that that's his claim to fame, because he's had a wealth of experience in the past. Pete is Alberta's business mechanic and the owner of Blue Neck Consulting. He grew up in a small family business that ultimately led him to a career to work for both Fortune 500 and other emerging companies in management, executive, and board positions. I found it interesting reading his story. He grew up learning to work hard. His mother ran the family strawberry farm. His father owned an equipment and repairs business. And at 5 years old, Pete started sweeping floors in his father's shop for 25 cents a day. By the age of 8, he was rebuilding carburetors. If you don't believe him, get him to rebuild yours. No, I'm just kidding. Pete has a degree in commerce from the University of BC and a certificate in high performance leadership from Cornell University. Interestingly, he went on to obtain senior positions with several Fortune 500 companies and many Canadian companies such as Canadian Tire, Mark's Work Wearhouse, IBM, HP, Fujitsu Consulting. When the Royal Klein government was in power, they had the Alberta Energy Program, which he worked with managing corporate projects with budgets of over $40 million. As much as Pete enjoyed that whole career, about 10 years ago, he decided that he would return to his roots, helping family-owned businesses that he knew had really been the backbone of his growing up, childhood years and teen years, learning to care about their own people and community and those who didn't have access to resources that larger organizations had access to. So he's not your average business coach, but he does a terrific job, an outstanding job working with small and medium businesses to tune up their businesses and to get them running smoothly with increased power and performance. So let's welcome Pete. He and his wife, Robin, reside in Calgary. And like I say, he's been a great friend and a coach to me. I know you'll enjoy his presentation today on innovation and change. Pete, it's all yours.
Thanks, Don. I really appreciate the generous introduction, even though I wrote half of it.
That's right. That way I know it's true.
I'm just going to bring up the slides at this point. So hopefully everybody can see this. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about innovation and change, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion today. I've been involved in a lot of change in my career, some of it personal, a lot of it family, but some of the bigger projects I've been involved with has been redesigning and transforming the land title registry in BC, remediating the deregulation of electricity in Alberta, launching a partnership between a local Toronto company and Saks Fifth Avenue. And I've seen a lot of change. And my first change project actually was about 1993, which kind of gives you an idea of my age. But I got a chance to work with somebody who was pretty amazing at the time. She had done, her name was Dell Langdon, and she worked out of the San Francisco Bay Area and had been acquired by one of the companies I worked with, and got her to work on a project with me up in Canada. Learned a lot about change and innovation from Dell. One of her claims to fame is that there's a business case that Harvard used for many, many years based on work that Dell had done with Citibank. And it was a time at Citibank where they were trying to figure out how to streamline their loan processing and application process in the company. And they hired Dell because she seemed to know what she was talking about. Truth of the matter, she was making it up as she was going along, but learned a tremendous amount of stuff based on the theory that she brought to the table, and brought that experience up to Canada. And I learned a tremendous amount from Dell, and I owe a lot of what's going on in this presentation to that start. But I'm going to tell you a little interesting story here that seems to have nothing to do with change, but in many ways it does. So let me see if I can get this going here. When I was about 18 years old and out of high school, I took a college level course with a brilliant young professor who was a really gifted lecturer on the topic of epistemology and metaphysics. So for those of you who don't know, epistemology is probably a science that we all need a lot more of these days, which is being able to tell the difference between what is a real justifiable belief and what is just mere opinion. And the other part of it was metaphysics, which was determining what was the nature of reality and existence. And the brilliance of those lectures was that in 1 hour, what he would start to do is pose a bit of a question that seemed like it had an obvious answer. And it was obvious because we'd all had an experience and had a strong opinion of what the answer was. And then he would go through the lecture and he would slowly pick apart that assumption. And to the point at the end of it that he'd pull a string, because really what he was doing is he was letting out a net to catch us all. And at the end of the lecture, in the last 10 minutes, he would haul in the net and bring us all to the exact same point of aha. And it was a brilliant course that experience happened every week I was there. And I've never been in another course that was quite like it. But it started to question what I believed was real and what my opinions were versus what were really justified beliefs. And to some degree, if you look at branches of Christianity like apologetics, a lot of that concept comes in through epistemology as well, which is really understanding the difference between just holding a belief because we've been told it and really examining it and finding the truth in it, finding the basis and foundation of it so that we can stand on it more firmly. And then change happens. So what am we talking about here? So first point, I think, is that we all find comfort and safety in believing that the world that we live in and understand today is going to be here when we wake up again tomorrow. And that just isn't true. The reality is that in a lot of points in our life, we get the blessing of being able to wake up to a similar world that we did yesterday, but every day it's a little bit different. And some days it's vastly different. For my wife and I, we have family history that goes back into the Ukraine. There are thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of families across the Ukraine, millions really, who woke up one morning with bombs dropping on them and their world changed dramatically. There are other times in your life where you wake up the next day and something happens and you are called to Christ. And it just happens. The thing is that when the expectations around us fail, it often triggers some degree of discomfort, resistance, and even fear of what's going to come next, because all of a sudden the foundation of what we thought was our reality has changed. And so when we're looking at change, whether that's change for ourselves or it's change for our businesses, and I'll talk a little bit more about change in our businesses today, is that we have to understand that when we're introducing change to the people around us, we are in fact getting them to wake up to a different reality and a different world than what they've become used to. And when we talk about change, we often say, well, people resist change. We say that we throw out that terminology on a regular basis. And although on the face of it, it's true, it doesn't really explain much. So what this is coming to is that perhaps it's not the change itself, but is our loss of certainty and control that threatens our sense of safety and comfort in what we know. That's really where the resistance to change is coming from, not the change itself. Because if you think about it, there are points in your life where you are looking forward to change. And then there are points where change occurs and it creates discomfort in our life. When you're changing things in a business or an organization, whether it's your own business, whether it's a volunteer group, whether it's your church, or it doesn't matter. Introducing change creates resistance from that lack of safety and comfort in what we knew before. Now, one thing I can tell you about change and introducing it into any business is that it is a risky thing to do. I promised myself I probably shouldn't quote this, but I will, only because the quote is from Niccolo Machiavelli, who is probably one of the most immoral people in history that has ever been written up and made famous. But Machiavelli lived in the 1500s, and he was not an unintelligent man. He may have been immoral, but he was not an unintelligent. And he observed, paraphrase a bit, is the most dangerous thing you can do in any organization is to introduce change. The reason being is that you will find enemies from people who are benefiting from the old way of doing things. And you will find only lukewarm supporters from people who are going to benefit from the new order, because there is uncertainty in the benefit of the new order. Brilliant observation. One of the reasons that 1/3 of all change initiatives and organizations fail outright. I have been reading these studies since the late 1980s. The stat hasn't fundamentally changed. The other thing is another 1/3 of them don't work as well as expected. So even if you're semi-successful in a change, only about 1/3 of the time will it actually meet your expectations. Now, though, this is... Hi, Erwin. Can you put your... can you go on mute, perhaps?
I can.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there anybody else who's got a... If you've got your mic on, thank you. Now, this high failure rate is not a mystery, because for the last 30 years, the reasons for these change failures has been well documented. The number one is lack of leadership. People start a change, but they don't recognize that it requires leadership to take people through a change. It takes leadership to also get people bought into the change. There are also external dependencies, lack of communications, and inadequate or bad planning, because we go, hey, let's just make this change and see how it turns out, usually badly. Lack of skills and resources. If you're doing something new, sometimes you don't know how to do it, but you assume you're going to figure it out. And the last one is really continually changing your change, which seems really weird, but the answer is that if once you've decided to make a change, it's best to plan it out and execute it as best you can to the plan without continually changing that plan. Now, with all that high failure rate and the reasons for change and the effort that you have to put in, why would you do it? Well, it turns out there are lots of good reasons to initiate a change and not just sit there and do the same thing. Will Rogers, a kind of cowboy philosopher from the 1920s and 1930s, said even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. In other words, we have to change. One of the 5 reasons. One of them is we have to fix a problem. There's a problem, we have to adapt to it. So, for example, many times I see clients who've got some really bad processes, often with a lot of paper and people, and it fails. A little bit of automation and that problem goes away. It's called an adaptive change. I haven't really changed what I do, I'm just fixing a problem. The second one is responding to a threat. That's called a reactive change. So, for example, a lot of restaurants across Canada, when the lockdowns happened, adapted to that threat of that lockdown by introducing delivery, like skip the dishes, and all sorts of other delivery methods. And it helped a number of them survive through the COVID lockdowns and the pandemic. there's also the opportunity to pursue something that's new and maybe a good opportunity. And a good business person will recognize also not just problems and threats, but opportunities. And that's called a transitional change. So I'm not transitioning my business from where I am to something a little bigger, a little bit more enhanced. So for example, if I'm offering new product lines or locations or services. So, one of the things that I appreciate being in Calgary is I hate storing my winter tires. A bunch of years ago, most of the tire shops in the area offered tire storage for a small fee. So they take my winter tires off, put them in their warehouse. So it wasn't in my garage. I liked that. Made them a little extra money, but it also tied me to coming back to them when I had to do the tire changeover. So smart business opportunities. A little bit more complicated is trying to create an advantage in your business. But this is what also helps differentiate your business from everybody else out there and potentially attract a whole new series of clients or customers. So one example would be Harry's Razors. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Harry's Razors, but it was a company that went from a startup to a $250 million company in under 8 years. And essentially, they sold razors. Nothing particularly amazing about the razors, except for one difference. They didn't sell it as a product. They sold it as a subscription. You subscribed to Harry's Razors, and every few weeks you would get a new razor with a new blade. That turned out to be enough of a innovation that created a $250 million industry. Pretty amazing. That's some of the power of being innovative. The biggest one, and very few organizations attempt this, is a fundamental realignment of what they do. Now, some of us have been through a transformation when we decided to turn our lives over to Christ. I experienced that a bunch of years ago, where I turned over my business to Christ through prayer, and God led me through a very large transformation. This kind of transformational change really cuts to the core of why you're in business and what you do and why you do it. When you're not in a Christian environment, often this is driven by some massive opportunity or some massive failure. One of the classics that everybody has heard of is, if you remember, Eastman Kodak, a multi-billion-dollar company that essentially went broke a few years ago and is a little niche player in the film and replication industry now. They failed to transform into a digital company when everybody else went to digital cameras. They failed. Some of us transform because God calls us to transform. Sometimes it's just a serendipitous opportunity that changes everything. If you don't know the story of Nintendo back in the 1960s was a hundreds of years old Japanese company that fairly diversified. It sold playing cards, instant rice, vacuum cleaners, and it owned a series of budget hotels in Japan. It sent one of its representatives over to the US when it bought a playing card business in the US because it wanted to expand, and discovered that playing cards weren't any more lucrative in the United States than they were in Japan. But one of the janitors in the building talked to him about this new idea of electronic games, learned everything there was about electronic games, and within a decade, Nintendo shifted their entire business into the electronic gaming business and is now a multi-billion-dollar organization. That's transformation. So good reasons, but risky to do change. So what does the Bible tell us about change? I'm going to go three things. What is our role in leading change, and what skills do we need to be able to do it? Well, the Bible tells us about change, that even if it comes directly from God, we can struggle with the change. There was a joke that Don and I were talking about, well, if we heard God's voice directly, it would be a lot easier to change. Well, that didn't seem to be true for Moses. If you remember, Moses fled Egypt when he was driven out, spent 40 years in exile, got married, had a family around him, raised sheep. And at the age of 80 years old, roughly, he got a call from God that says, go liberate my people from Egypt. If you remember Moses's response to that, now here's the direct word of God speaking directly and clearly to a man who believed in God. And his response was, I think you got the wrong guy. Change is hard, no matter what, ladies and gentlemen. And the Bible tells us time and time again that change is difficult. Throughout the entire Old Testament, there are struggles. Throughout the New Testament, there are struggles of people dealing with change. To convert Saul to Paul took a massive direct impact, speaking directly from Jesus Christ, striking the man blind to get his attention. Change is hard, and God knows it. The second thing is that God is going to be alongside of us through it. Joshua 1:19, have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid or dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with you wherever you go. The third thing that God tells us is that change is necessary, even if our core purpose really isn't going to change. So sometimes we think that, we've accepted Christ into our lives, we're believers, we are good Christians, we don't really have to change, and there's nothing further from the truth. The entire miracle of the New Testament was that the Jewish people believed that they were doing just fine. They believed that the Pharisees were good people, they were in control, they were able to manage their people religiously despite Roman occupation, and yet they were broken and they needed to change. They needed salvation. So even when we think we're doing okay, we need to change. The last one is that our world by nature is transient and impermanent. Corinthians 4:16, for the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So things in the world are going to change around us consistently. And we know that in our businesses that things do change, and we have to figure out how to deal with the change, even if our core purpose has not changed. And we know that there's lots of things that are changing, but it seems like things are changing even faster. I used to think it was just because I'm getting older, but when I really examine this, the pace of change in our world is in fact accelerating, and there is a lot of information and statistics to back this up. If we look at population growth, it has been exponential over the last 40 years. From 1980 to now, actually, let me tell you, by next year, we're going to go from 1980, a world population of about 4 billion people, that by early 2023, we will be an $8 billion person planet. That's an enormous amount of growth in people. We've also had to deal with coronaviruses. We've had to deal with disruptions in the supply chain in our economy. We've had to deal with climate change. But there's so many other things that are impacting us. Changes to our government, our laws, our social structure. We have wars that are breaking out in Europe. We've got technology changing, it seems, weekly. We're moving from fossil fuels to green energy. All of these things are impacting us personally, but also impacting our businesses. and it is getting faster. So we need to embrace change, because change is necessary to realize God's plan for us to become, even just to become new and reborn in him. We have to change. To become better followers of him, we have to change. But we also need to change for our businesses to be able to realize God's plan for our business. We have to invite God into our businesses and transform our businesses to act and behave consistent with what he wants us to be. And that's really one of the huge core foundational tenets of what we're trying to do at the CCBF, which is to invite God into your business life and then learn how that's going to transform businesses into a beacon of light in our communities. We can only do that if we change. So what are the 4 biggest blockers to change? Of all the things that can go wrong, my experience in reality and lived reality has been that there are 4 huge blockers to change that happen all the time, and we need to overcome them. If we're changing our business, the first thing that goes wrong is a misunderstanding. People take time to really understand what the change is intended to be, what in fact is changing. The second thing, if they don't understand that, they will make stuff up, and it will probably be wrong, and it'll probably be critical. The second thing is they don't see a clear reason for the change. So as business people, often we have a great idea and we can see it clearly, but we fail to communicate that to people and say, there's a really good reason we're changing. Let me explain it to you. And it's not just a reason for the business. You have to take it down to why this is a good reason for them personally. The third blocker is skepticism. Even though they understand what the change is and they understand why it might be a good thing, they don't actually believe it's going to work. So you have to have a good plan and explain to them what your plan is so that they overcome the skepticism when they see the plan starting to work. Last but not least is a lack of urgency or lack of necessity that's perceived to do it. Why? Well, everything's working just fine right now. Why do we have to change? If you don't have an answer for that and the other 3 blockers, you're going to have an unusual amount of resistance in your organizations towards change. So we have to lead change by describing the vision of where we're going. And a vision is not just a simple description. It's a compelling description of a future state. What are we becoming? What do we aspire to become? That's the vision. Well, making a change, what is that change going to look like that's going to be compelling and interesting? The second thing we have to do is we have to promote the value of achieving it. What good is going to come from it? Explain how they are going to have a piece of that plan, and then remove all the reasons for procrastination. I had a friend of mine work for Ernst & Young for many years, and he was pretty good at change. And I said, well, how do you do it in your practice? And he said, well, there's 2 steps to successful change. So the first one is you imagine yourself locked in a room, and there's a window, a beautiful window that is wide open, that's showing sunshine and fields and flowers, and it's just attractive to go to. And that's the visioning part. And I said, what's the second part? He says, then you douse the room in gasoline and light a match to it so they can't stay there. So you have to remove the reasons for procrastination one way or another. If I look at this example and say, how did this apply to what Jesus did in his ministry? First of all, he answered the what question, like what's going to change, which is he wanted to bring us into a reconciled relationship with God. Okay, can understand that. The second thing he did was he explained why we want to have a reconciled relationship with God, which is so that we can have an eternal life with him in the kingdom of heaven, which he described as a pearl so beautiful that we would sell everything we had to have it. So this is the compelling reason why you want to have a reconciled relationship with God. Then he said, how do you do that? Well, turn away from evil, accept Jesus's gift of salvation on the cross, and live according to his commandments. And then the last one was when. And Jesus gave us this strong sense of urgency because we never know when the knock is going to happen at the door. So in his ministry, he did an amazing job of dealing with these 4 blockers. We can too. Skills we need. We need as leaders of change, we need to demonstrate our commitment to the change. Jesus and his followers were committed. There was a strategy and a plan that was credible, and Christ proved it to us. We need to have empathy for people's fear and skepticism for the change, because it will happen. It doesn't mean that it's going to fail because of it. We need patience for those who need to catch up with us. Not everybody is wired the same way. Some people take a longer time to figure it out. We need to be persistent because we know there's going to be setbacks, just as there were setbacks in Paul's journey. We need to tolerate uncertainty. I don't know how many times that I've dealt with clients who want virtually a written guarantee that the change we're about to make is going to be 100% successful. There is none. The only certainty we can have, because we have the blessings of being part of a Christian community, is that we believe in God, and there's a certainty in believing in God. But for so many people that will work for us, or customers that are coming in the door, or suppliers that are working with us, they don't have that certainty. There's going to be some skepticism that we'll just have to work through. We also need a willingness to communicate frequently and authentically. And the key word there is authentically. People know when they're being lied to or when they're being given brochureware. There's nothing like the leader of the organization, the owner of the company, standing in front of the employees and saying, this is what's happening, and here's why. Sending out a memo just doesn't cut it. So just to recap, change is hard, but it's also valuable. And it's also a necessity in God's kingdom. And it needs leadership. And my hope is that people on this call and watching the recording later will have that bravery of leadership. I promised you a little bit of innovation, and I can't talk about innovation for, I'll get started and I'll go on forever, but I'll give you a hint. There is a path. It isn't just, let's try something new and throw spaghetti at a wall, because then you're going to get your 66 or 70% failure rate guaranteed. Basic path: define your need. Don't just brainstorm without its context. Decide what should change, because not everything that can change should. Be very careful, because there's a cost to pay when you change. Generate your ideas and then evaluate those ideas. Figure out why they might not work. And then see if those reasons that the idea might not work can be fixable. Because just because there's a problem with an idea doesn't mean the problem is unresolvable. Sometimes you can work through it and still come up with a really good idea. Then you have to plan the implementation. Figure out who's going to be involved, roll it out in stages, and then put the effort in to sustain the change through the difficult transformation that people have to go through to accept and adopt the change and make it part of their normal life again. That in a nutshell is the path of innovation. I want to thank you for listening patiently so far this morning. And I know we have a little bit of time now to open it up for discussion and talk about change and ask questions and kind of explore this topic a little deeper. So I'm going to turn it over to Don to moderate that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pete, for an excellent presentation. You've given us lots to think about, and very practical, very biblical, and very thoughtful. And so now why don't we just open it up, and if you want to unmute yourself and raise a question, or if you'd make a comment, feel free to do that too. Or if you'd like to add something to what Peter has said, he hasn't declared that he's the ultimate authority, so there may be some room for other ideas.
Thank you, Peter, for your great topic. Innovation, I love it because I'm an accountant and I like technology. So you really hit a number of strands there of focus there. And yeah, we provide accounting services to companies that don't want to run their accounting departments. So that's where we innovate, and we do that by subscription service, basically, right? You pay as you go.
Yep.
And a lot of companies are moving to that model. A lot of companies, fortunately, don't like accounting and bookkeeping. So, and we use the latest technology online. So NetSuite or Zoho One or whatever other package seems to fit the bill for a business. So yeah, that was great. And change in our team too. We implement in stages too, not only ourselves, but our customers, because if you implement in stages, you don't overwhelm them as much as if you try to implement everything at once. So yeah, you hit all the bases there for sure. Well done, Peter.
Thanks, Barry. Question for you. What's been the toughest thing in implementing change in your own organization that you found?
Yeah, the one you said where not everybody's going to grasp it at the same time. So what we do is I find a couple champions, one or two champions, and first I implement the change on myself, which I've tried it the other way, implementing with others first, but I figured, okay, I'm going to implement change first. If I can't do it, then who else is going to want to do it? So I implement the change myself. I roll it out to two other champions, and then they roll out to the rest of the team. So that's worked really well.
Yep. That's also a very good technique, is when you start to see people leading that change, you'll start to find people follow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of like the snowball effect. Once the ball gets rolling, others will jump on board.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to be the first, though, except myself, I think.
And that's leading by example. Can't be beat as a process.
Right.
Go for it, Paul.
Thanks very much, Peter. I really appreciated the presentation, and I was just reflecting on my experience as a Canadian Air Force officer in the mid to late 90s, when the Cold War was over, and the governments were looking to reap the dividend by reducing military budgets to the point where we couldn't do everything anymore. But in the Air Force, there was a huge change effort. But I just reflecting on how it went from my perspective as sort of a mid-level officer, that there were a couple of other blocks. There were hidden agendas. There were sacred cows. There were there was a very unclear definition of what it was that the Canadian military was supposed to do now that the Cold War was over. And so I remember one team building exercise in Shearwater, Halifax area, with brigadier generals and colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors, and we're all sitting around a table doing a team building exercise where we're supposed to be building widgets with bolts and nuts, and we're all screaming, "We know how to change. Just tell us what you want us to change into, and we'll happily go there." But building widgets was not it was not building anything other than skepticism.
One of the blockers, which is what's the change we're trying to do here?
Yeah. What is it that you want us to do? And I remember, I shouldn't go on too long, but I wrote a paper for a course at a year-long course, and I wrote a paper on why the Canadian Air Force should not do search and rescue. It was not a military task. We had no concept of doing search and rescue in combat situations. We had the capability to do it, but I argued that that kind of capability could be built up in a civilian enterprise. It didn't need to be the military. And the paper was ultimately rejected because, as I acknowledged in my conclusion, that the Canadian military got good PR from search and rescue. Therefore, we will continue to do it.
And do you think that was a valid reason to continue?
No. You could, I mean, you could argue about capability. And certainly expertise and the type of people that do search and rescue for the military, that's well above and beyond what I see in any civilian enterprise at the moment. But PR, when you're cutting to the bone, you have to find out what's essential and what's not essential.
Excellent point, Paul. And if you're going to be making changes, you have to understand what is the core of what you're doing and what's really important. You know, and things do change. I mean, from businesses, they do change by all those things I put on that one slide. The military gets affected by whether or not there's a wartime need or not. And we seem to need to have that capability all the time, but we don't want to fund it all the time. So the politicians have a difficult time of allocating budgets towards it.
Yeah.
You know, we need national security, but can we do it for free? Short answer, no. And that's true in businesses as well. I mean, a lot of businesses through COVID had to decide to make some, and I hate the word because it's so overused at this point, but they had to make some changes. It's what they call the pivot. And they had to do it to survive, but they had to do it to figure out what it was the core of their business that they needed to preserve, and how could they use that core in a way that would allow them to continue to have clients and business and an inflow of cash. And that was a very difficult process. I know even at the CCBF, we had to go through that. That was a difficult process, as a large chunk of the membership was meeting during breakfast times. And those had to either transition to Zoom calls, or they had to be put on hiatus, or something else had to be replaced with it. And these are difficult changes because to some degree, because it's not like anybody chose it. It's not like anybody chose to all of a sudden find that there wasn't any kind of peacekeeping or wartime requirement for the Canadian military. It happened, and you know, it's just something you have to deal with. The positive thing about that is that it gives you a difficult to ignore reason to change. You can ignore it for only so long before it really starts to bite you. And I find often that, you know, if you go through the Bible as well, there are lots of times that God goes, okay, I'm shutting off all possibility of you ignoring me at this point. You know, a good friend of mine who runs a Christian-based business here in Calgary calls it the shovel across the back of the head. Occasionally we are, and God realizes that most of us have a solid, stubborn streak in us. And every once in a while, change is impacted by a shovel across the back of the head that says, okay, it is time to wake up and listen and change, because you cannot ignore this anymore. And, you know, once that comes, as uncomfortable and as angry as it may make you feel, I've learned to respond to it with, this is a gift, and it's going to get me to do something different that I never would have considered doing had this not occurred. And it's God's way of leading us forward in creating sometimes a great opportunity, but sometimes it comes, and quite often it comes in great crisis. But that crisis is an opportunity.
Peter, just full disclosure, I'm a change management consultant. I did my master's thesis in org change and have executed change in billion-dollar companies. So I would just complement your presentation and add two things. what I find a lot of leaders, they start with a message and they assume that their message and their words will change everything. And really underneath their organization are what I call 4 reinforcing structures that drive behavior every day. It's the KPIs, the personal assessments that have accountabilities and reward certain behaviors and have created that organization, and a number of other things. But my point is, people start change thinking it's personal, when in reality it's organizational. That if you go into make sure that before you speak the message, that the accountabilities have been aligned underneath it to align with the new message, and then you speak it once, and then the change can go quickly. The resistance I find often is that people, we assume that because I have set a new message, that you've undone everyone's accountabilities and realigned them to the new message. And that in every organization I've ever been in, it's never happened. And so people go, I go in and for 6 or 8 weeks, adjust accountabilities, speak for 2 hours, and the change lasts for 4 years. So I would just encourage the people who are listening that before we're leaders, we try to respond to things we hear, like inspirational messages. But our people who work, I always refer to it as have a DNA in their head, a daily need to accomplish. Mm-hmm. They know what they're accountable for. They know what they're going to get yelled at for, and they know what they're not going to get yelled at for. And they try, and they smile when you say something new, but invariably their behavior goes back to that box because that's what they're held accountable for. Now we're in very small organizations, it's different, but once you get into large scale with multiple levels, I find it easy and very much more successful is if you say, yes, I have a message. What is all the, and often you're right, you need help to see the objective side of it, but to say, does that person's accountabilities align with this new approach? Because often I find people say, well, that person's resistant. Well, actually, if you look at their accountabilities, it drives exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do. And so you end up spending a lot of personal time, you shred relationships, all because you didn't stop and adjust the accountabilities first. And just I've done a couple of speeches on practical change leadership for Chief Executive Network in the States. So I'm in near Toronto. I'm just saying, if there is ever something that we really need to do is how to do change and do it in a way that isn't that respects people, that honors their, I always refer to this as, if you honor people's past, they'll let you take them to the future. But because we often start our change process say, we're terrible, we're terrible, we're terrible. And we forget that their behavior is really the result of our reinforcement anyways. So we're the cause of their behavior. So we've already started that with our, in our foot in a grave, so to speak. And we should say, you guys have done great things. You've innovated, but there's a new thing. I need your help to do that. And I got an idea on the strategic level, but the tactics, help me. And that half-finished idea can work so well. So that's just the two things would be that sometimes change, we think it's personal. If everybody just, I just want them to be on side. Well, they don't care. They're accountable. Change the accountabilities first, then they'll move. And the second thing is just to honor their experience and their innovation before, and then you start and they go, you've honored me. Okay, I can move with you. What are we doing now? And then involve them in that half-finished idea. So that's the two things I would add to your presentation. But very good. And boy, do we need, we can show great leadership as we respect people and care for them and honor them and show them. And that's the way we can show the love of Christ. And I do that in my job. I share Jesus with my colleagues and my clients. But boy, change is it's difficult. But if we realize it's not just personal, but it's organizational, and we change accountability, it changes everything. So that's what I would add. I apologize.
No, Keith, those are wonderful, wonderful observations, and adds to the concept. And you're quite right. I mean, change is like it's like planting a seed, and eventually it takes root. And if you want to change that, you almost have to kind of pull out all the supporting structures that are supporting that original idea that you want to change. And because it creates and evolves into a sustaining structure over time that is difficult. I spent 10 years, for a little example, I spent 10 years marketing and working with the provincial governments in Western Canada. And, the politicians, the cabinet ministers would all be very frustrated in how difficult it was to implement their policies and make change in government. Most of the seasoned ones understood it. The new ones were always massively frustrated that, weren't they in charge?
Yes.
And, to your point, Keith, if you look at really what happens at the bureaucratic layer, no one gets fired for doing nothing. People get fired for doing something that lights up the phones of the minister's office. So the safest thing for any bureaucrat to do is to do nothing until directly ordered and told exactly how to do it, to avoid all accountability.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so your point is very well taken. And so when we complain about what government is doing or not doing, I always look at this as a massive change exercise that somebody younger and braver than me will take on.
No, I remember doing a presentation for the 5 people who drove performance management for 67,000 provincial Ontario employees. And they told me how they had 36 different metrics that they drive for every manager. And I'm a simple guy, and I refer to it as the rule of 5. God gave you 5 fingers, and that's about the number we can handle in priorities. And I said to them, don't you find that when one person works on one aspect, they lose on 2 others? And they go, the whole 5 go, yeah, that's, we see that. and I said, wouldn't it be great if we distilled that down to 5 so that they could feel like they win every week? And they feel like they can feel like they leave the and line those and highlight them so that when they leave at the end of the week, they can feel, I've moved the ball down the field. And here's what they said. Yeah, but we've presented this very sophisticated method to our bosses, and they really like it. So I said, so your complicated method that drives disengagement is not as important as your esteem with your bosses. Do I have that right? And there was dead silence in the room, and I picked up my briefcase and said, I guess we're done.
Can't help you.
So, because you're right, you can't do what you can't do. So I apologize. That's too much of a story. I apologize.
I'll kind of turn it over to Don on this, on a church from quote from Winston Churchill. He says, no matter how perfect and beautiful your strategy, occasionally you must examine the results.
Well put. Well put.
Don, could I just ask one question? I feel like
Feel free.
I feel like a neophyte in this call with these 2 great change consultants. But you said something, Peter, about the fact that you always have early adopters, and then you have the people that are a little more cautious and so on. From your experience, and maybe Keith wants to, can you quantify the typical early adopters? Is there any sense of the kind of people that when you're introducing change in an organization, how do you quantify, how do you figure out who might be those people that are the early adopters? Are they the new ones in the organization? Are they younger ones? Give me some advice on that, because that's such a key. I think you have to work with a couple champions, and I think Barry was talking about that.
Yeah, it's almost like picking good jury members, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, how do you figure out who those people are?
Well, just before you start, Peter, I did a research project with 72 organizations for 3 years from a master's thesis on work change. I identified, and I asked them, did a verified champion help you achieve this goal? And the answer was no. So although it's helpful in some anecdotal situations, I think because for example, in a church, you have to align 4 levels of you have to align the pastor's team, the board, and then the key influences in the congregation. You have 4 people to manipulate at exactly the same time. If you don't move them all up, you don't go, because any one of those can invalidate the change. So looking for a champion in 4 levels of government is really difficult and challenging. And that's my experience anyway. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
No, Keith, your point is well taken in that when you have multi-level structures that you're dealing with, and particularly if you add to that external contingencies like external stakeholders or dependencies on things like clients, it can be very difficult to make changes. And in every change, I think Keith will agree with me, depending on the nature of the change in the situation in the organization, there are going to be different types of blockers that are going to be more important to deal with than others. When you're dealing with an organizational change, which is a little bit more compact, and you're looking for how that adoption curve occurs, it happens typically like any bell curve effect, that you're going to have early adopters, you're going to get a mass of people that are kind of come in, and then you're going to get a few stragglers at the end who are going to resist right to the end. It's helpful to figure out sometimes who's going to be on your side so you can get a little early momentum going. And that can be helpful. So I look at those two things, which is, I break it down to two P's, which is personality and position. So there are going to be certain personalities that are higher risk takers, more embracing of newness and change. And that personality type tends to be found in people that are typically a little younger than people, and newer to the organization than people who are more established, typically, but not always. I've been always one of those people that, hey, it's something new, let's go try it. But to look at the personality. Then the second thing is you look at the position, and people who have the least to gain and the most to lose from the change are not going to be the early adopters. You're going to look for people who are in a position in the organization that have the least to lose and the most to gain. And if they are of the right personality, they can see that opportunity, and there's not much for them to lose. They're likely going to get on board a lot quicker than somebody else who's been in the organization and been around for a long time and has their pattern, and, as Keith says, understand what they're going to get praised and yelled at for every day, how they're going to get paid, where their bonuses are coming from. Once you disrupt something where somebody's got a good thing going, you're probably going to find the highest resistors. And
if I could just add one more thing,
please.
Often change. Roy Moran in Kansas City is trying to do a hybrid church where he's doing half attraction and half discipleship and outgoing. And he's saying you can have a hybrid culture. And in my experience of 30 years of doing this, you can't. What you need to do is, what I do when I go is say, what's the next step? I have a tree in my backyard that every year every branch grows about that far and it's bright red. And by the end of the summer, it's gray. And then the spring comes and it grows again. So it grows, consolidates. Organizations do not grow like bamboo. So I always say, what's the next aligned step? So it's a small step forward, but at the same time, you have to align it with the ethos of the organization. So if I were Roy Moran, and I haven't talked to him lately, but I'm saying rather than have a hybrid church where you're trying to build two cultures, just say, I'm going to have my attraction model, but I'm going to have, because I'm used to having a mission organization in my church, I'm going to have a local mission. Oh, well, that matches my ethos. That's just a small incremental step away from my current ethos. And so that it's an incremental step that aligns, that you can show is an extrapolation that's totally rational and reasonable out from your existing strategy. And then people go, oh, well, that's okay. And then, so I think that's the key, aligned with your core organization's ethos, but a step. Don't go all the way. What's the next step I can do? And then I find, boy, I apologize. I'm excited about this. I love doing this. I'm passionate. I'm passionate about it. But folks, when they see how to do it properly, they all learn, and they can grow this, and we can coach them into doing this. It's so much fun. And churches especially, we need to branch out and do evangelism more effectively and reach out and have more lasting interfaces with non-Christians, not just come and change your tires, which is good, but it's not an interaction that lasts for months. And when people lost their Christ background, their Sunday school background, they don't know anything about God. You need to interact over time. So there's nothing more important that we need to do as churches and as Christians to align our thought process with what God's doing. But that next step is it's so easy to do, and it helps people be clear, be clear in my opinion. Sorry.
Marv, is that helpful?
Well, I think it got off the question, but I heard what Peter said, and my point was going to be, this is one of the biggest challenges in our churches and our Christian organizations is we do not value the younger, newer people coming into the organization because they are ready to make changes that are necessary. They don't have the positional power to do it. And I'll just leave it at that. You've confirmed in my mind, and I'm just saying, and having dealt with dozens and dozens of people over the year in Christian ministry, this is the biggest frustration of new younger leaders. And that's why we're running them off out of our organizations and missing the ability to change because we aren't embracing them with what they bring, especially to that early adoption stage. That's really critical for an organization to change. So thanks. I'll quit talking, Don, and I've enjoyed this very, very much. Thank you, guys.